Jamie, can you hear me? Welcome back, everybody, to week 6 of EDL 740 Zoom session. This is our last Zoom session for this term. As I told you before, next week in week 7, you will get a final exam instead of a Zoom session. I'm sure you'll enjoy it more. A reminder to you that everyone, please mute your microphone unless you're getting ready to talk to me. Next week, week 7, is a little shorter week. All of your assignments are due on Saturday night instead of Sunday night next week. My intention is to open up the week 7 module, Moodle module for you a little earlier, probably Saturday, perhaps even Friday, give you a little extra time to work on that, although there won't be any surprises. And I think in week 7, you'll probably find the content a little more interesting as it's more relevant to your work, since we're all educators. In the week 6 module, Moodle module, if you will, you'll find in the learning enhancements a survey that Lana Robinson asked us to put out there for you. Several of you probably had class under Lana. Anyway, in the learning enhancements in week 6, you'll see a need for cognition scale and student satisfaction survey. If you would take just a few minutes to fill that out so Lana can collect that data from you. On the Rethink discussion forum post, I really enjoyed reading your responses to that prompt this last week. It's quite informative to look into the minds of other learners and see how their personal learning differs from our own, even if we're examining the same content. April noted how two bright and critical thinkers can discern two completely different sets of important takeaways even when you're looking at exactly the same content. And others of you have commented on how your classmates pick up on or focus on something that you missed. Same thing happens in your classroom. I've mentioned that to you before, but I'd like to shift your perspective just ever so slightly. Most of you are already serving in a school leadership role, and some of you aspire actually to lead campuses and school districts somewhere out there in your career future. But on that differing perspectives, even though you're looking at and examining the same content, I invite you to think about that the same thing happens on leadership teams on campuses, even in executive teams and central offices. Tricky problems and important decisions are best tackled by teams of people and folks that see and hear and feel and smell issues differently and from different perspectives, all bring a very valuable insight into trying not only figuring out what the problems are, but also the solutions that we end up trying to craft for those things. That has implications, I think, for you in the way, another way to think of this too, in your hiring processes. In the way you assign the teams that you lead responsibilities, the way you delegate the work. For instance, math teachers, I used to be a math teacher. I charaded as a math teacher for about 15 years of my early career. But math teachers tend to look at data and problems and solutions, candidates, like math teachers. And counselors, Anna, tend to look at the world through the lens of counselors. And fine arts teachers, Teresa, tend to look at the world through the lenses of the fine arts community and perspective. And so that's one of the reasons as a campus principal and also as a school superintendent, I almost always hired people with a team of others. Even if it was a paraprofessional position or an at-will position, I would invite other people on my team into those interviews because they hear and look for and see different things from candidates as they're responding to the questions that you ask them. On the proposal push this week. I ask you one more time to polish up your question and then ask you to tell us what kind of barriers or challenges you anticipate in that. It's apparent from the ones of you that have posted already, and it's typical, and I fully expected for your questions to change a little bit. Some of you just threw the whole first question out the window and started over. Some of you polished and tightened your questions, that's the way researchers work and think. And then you're faced with the probability or the possibility of actually trying to launch a study. And that's why I asked you in that discussion forum prompt to discuss with us what you anticipated as challenges. Because actually collecting and getting the quality data that would inform your study is always presents some significant challenges, no matter how good a question you have or how tightly you design the study. Many of you on the learning task 4 and 5, when you've been reading studies, quite often the limitations that you note, and it's typical from studies across all kinds of professional genres, the response rate is pretty slim in a lot of cases. If you get, if you're using a survey, and you're studying about surveys and questionnaires this week, but if you get a 30% response rate to a survey, typically, you should do handsprings. It's just very difficult to get responses. My wife was reading some research to me. She and I start every morning about 5 a.m. sitting on our big chair together and reading different stuff. But she found an interesting article that was talking about the narrowing of the window of attention span over the last 20 years. And it was interesting. Those researchers concluded from their data collection that the average person's attention span has reduced from 12 seconds to 8 seconds over the last 20 years. I can see that in my grandchildren. If you got something that you want to say to them, you want to catch their attention, you better get it done quickly because they move at warp speed. Same thing in these classes. It's one of the reasons that I feed you the content that I feed you, and I switch it, the formatting. And also one of the reasons that I collect your responses the way I do, because I want to try to make the most of your limited attention. And all of you even have jobs and children and families and stuff like that that compete for your attention as well. Not to mention bills, and some of you are raising teenagers, good grief. Anyway, lit reviews. We spent the last week studying about lit reviews. And it was interesting to read your responses on your learning task to that. The lit reviews, interestingly enough, I love reading a good literature review, and I just abhor reading a poor one. But it's all about surveying the collective thinking in the particular field of interest, whatever you're studying, and trying, as the person that's developing the lit review, is trying to make sense of that collective thinking for both for ourselves and also for the audiences that we're trying to either inform or influence, depending on how you look at it. Laying the groundwork for the case that you're about to make, if your lit review is for the purpose, and that's the context that we're discussing it in this course. If the lit review is for the purpose of supporting your study and preparing you for it, then really you're using the lit review as a groundwork for making the case that you end up trying to make with your data and your conclusions. It's really a journey of bringing coherence to the subject. You've probably heard the old adage that everyone has an opinion and everybody has an anal opening. I guess that's true, I'm not sure. But everyone typically does have an opinion, and even the people that are writing literature reviews and doing studies have an opinion, and it's pretty hard to separate your opinion from what you're concluding, either the synthesis of the literature review or the conclusions from your study. But those opinions, in my view, I understand everybody has an opinion, but in my view, the ones that I really care about are the ones that are informed opinions. And that's where, when you're doing the lit review, it gives you the opportunity to let the readers or your audience know that your opinion is an informed one. You're increasingly aware of the volume of literature, I think, available to you, not only within those different kinds of topics that I pitch at you each week in Learning Tasks 4 and 5, but you're becoming more and more aware, I think, of the literature that's available that's already published within your particular interest areas. And I've mentioned this to you before, but it's a good idea always, and Dr. Patton, in his video on the mistakes of literature reviews, he mentioned this too. He called them the classic works. Some other people call them the seminal works. But it's a good idea if you keep seeing a particular work referenced again and again and again, it's a good idea to stick your nose in it, see what it's like. Typically, if a lot of people are citing it or referencing a particular document, it's because it's got some quality to it. And I've mentioned this to you as well before. There's a daisy chain of evidence and quality literature you can find in those on the best studies that you come up with and the best thinkers that you find. It's always a good idea to read what they're reading. For instance, if some of you actually have got questions along these lines, but if you're studying child development, you probably want to read some of Piaget's work. If you're into experiential learning, you probably want to read some John Dewey. If you're interested in or you're doing a study on lesson design, you probably want to read Wiggins and McTighe. If you're interested in servant leadership, read Robert K. Greenleaf. Do it. Those are sort of the pinnacle people in those particular fields. And not only do you want to read what they have written, but you also want to see who they've been reading and who they reference in their own works. Any source is fair game, but it's really on your literature review. Any source is fair game, but you really want to stick with the scholarly works because it adds to your credibility. I'm a blogger, but I believe my audience adds credence to my thoughts based on what I've read. And those of you that have stuck your nose in my blog know that whenever, you've received email from me, you know I'm always got my nose in at least 2 books, one fiction and one nonfiction. But if you've looked at my blog, you also see that I give a brief little synopsis of each of those nonfiction books that I read. And it's for that very purpose, is I want my audience to understand that my opinions and my thoughts are framed against me sticking my nose into the works of many bright people and trying to stick my mind into the minds of many bright people. The writing piece, and I know we have some English teachers in the group, and when I say this in front of math teachers, they look at me crazy. But speaking as a former principal and a former school superintendent, I don't know that there is anything that you and I ask of our students, our young students, that's more intellectually challenging than to write and write well. Quality writing is never done on the first pass. It requires a lot of rereading and revising. Several of you have mentioned in your comments the importance of having valued others read your writing. And from the research I've seen, some of the highest quality writing instruction occurs when you have peer reviewing and peer editing of your writing. And it doesn't matter really how young the children are. And for those of you that are headed into school leadership formally or informally, Sloppy writing is a distraction, and it'll take away from your message and your influence. That's one of the reasons, both as a principal and a school superintendent for probably the last 15 years, I required a timed writing exercise of everyone that was applying for a professional position on our team. And it came as a shock to a lot of people because very few of them had gone into an interview and actually had to start the interview out with a 45-minute time writing exercise. But in the world that you and I live in, so much of the communication that occurs, both between professionals as well as between us and our external audiences, which is our parents and our community members, so much of that is done is in writing. And to me, it's just extremely important that the people on our team have to be able to express themselves pretty clearly and pretty succinctly in written form. This week, I guess it was last week, I pitched in the discussion forum the standard Scopic prompt to you. I pitched that at you for a couple of reasons. One, I wanted to turn your thinking to the ELCC standards. And also, I wanted to get you to think about how school leaders can influence the culture by the way they choose to spend their time and effort. One of my mentors, which happened to be a gentleman that actually served as Commissioner of Education here in Texas for a number of years, Dr. Mike Moses. But Dr. Mike Moses used to say to us that you could tell what's important to someone by watching how they spend their time and how they spend their money. Pretty wise counsel, I think. Anyway, slow down, look carefully. There's some good lessons for all of us in referencing that standard Scopic prompt. Be very aware of how school leaders are spending their time, because I think it'll help you do a better job of delegating, chunking out your own time, effort, and money as well. Literature reviews and the research process. In an unfettered world of information, we have to be our own filters as much as we ever have in time. It's interesting, both in this format, there was a time that if I was going to be on television, so to speak, I would have to jump through a lot of hurdles and receive permission, if you will, from a lot of different people at different layers. Same thing goes with my blogging. Same thing goes with your publishing. Some of you probably would bet money. Some of you have read books that were self-published, in which the writer just completely circumvented the publishing houses. The same thing is happening in the music industry, and that's turning that industry on its head. So it's these technologies that you and I are becoming more and more comfortable using, allowing us to go directly to our audiences without anybody else's permission, and we can completely avoid the gatekeepers. There is some responsibility on that, on our side of that equation, if we choose to try to do that. That we have to become much more effective filters, both of the information that we're consuming that we want to relay to others, but that gatekeeping effect is really no longer the domain of the publishers. It becomes more and more our responsibility. On the lit reviews and the research process, there is, let's see, I think it was the North Carolina Writing Center group, seems like, made the comment about being careful about using too many quotations or too many citations. And so as a scholar, and that's what we are, it's important to hit that the Goldilocks area where it's just the right amount. Too many citations can put your readers off pretty quickly. So it's really not, we're not trying to impose a citation tsunami on people. But at the same time, they warned against too much paraphrasing, and that's wise counsel as well. You don't want to completely rely on paraphrasing all the stuff that you're reading. A nice mix, and really on the quotation stuff, a nice rule of thumb, if you will, on the quotation stuff is to quote the authors that I strongly recommend the brief quotations rather than the 8-line or beyond quotations. But quote the authors and the ideas and the concepts that really drive home a point that you're trying to make. Because your lit review is really about sense making and synthesizing, both for yourself and your audience. So you're building your knowledge, you're building your credibility, and you're also building your case to either get people to support your conclusion, or in some cases, you're trying to flat out influence them in some way or another, particularly those of us in the leadership roles. So quote sparingly. I hate reading research in which the literature review is just one long quotation after another. And it seems like the author is trying to substitute volume for quality critical thinking and synthesis. And I would advise you against that. In week 6, right now we're in week 6, and you're taking a look a little more closely at some of the specific tools, surveys and questionnaires and so forth. And I think that'll probably be helpful to you. Not so much, because I know you're not doing a study, and I think it'll be helpful to you as you think about the questions that you're devising and how you might create a tool to collect that data. And then week 7, I think you'll find a little more enjoyable next week, because it's not quite as technical and not quite as abstract. I mean, we're going to focus specifically on theories of learning. And since we're all educators, we're in the business of learning. So I think you'll find it a little more interesting. But on those theories of learning, the reason I framed that week 7 that way for you, and we've had several questions running up to this date about theoretical frameworks. And so really those theories of learning are in a sense theoretical frameworks. So, whether you're talking about cognitivism or positivism, or I mentioned to you Howard Gardner's multiple intelligences theory last week. I think you'll find that week 7 content a bit of a fresh air for you. Okay. The book recommendations that I want to bring to your attention this week, if you care or not, and I've told you before, you can find those on my website if you want to. But on the topic of the communication and the connectedness in those streams of influence, as Dr. Patton called them, the genealogy, the heritage, the intellectual heritage that we have. One of the most interesting books I've read in the last couple of years is actually by a forester, a German forester named Wohleben. And the title of the book was The Hidden Life of Trees, What They Feel and How They Communicate. Absolutely mind-boggling to consider that trees are actually communicating with each other more below the soil surface than above. But I was drinking the Kool-Aid of that guy by the time I was finished with the book. And it really made a lot of sense to me from an organizational behavior perspective, the interconnectedness of all the people in the organization and how they contribute to it. Another book that came to my mind on this topic of writing clearly and well, a guy by the name of Steve Pressfield, and the title of the book, and it was 2016, by the way, The Hidden Life of Trees book was 2016 copyright, and Pressfield's book was 2016 copyright. But the title of that one is Nobody Wants to Read Your Shit, Why That Is, and What You Can Do About It. And I found that a very entertaining book, but it was also a very helpful book to help me get my mind around how best to write in a way that captures attention, holds attention, and makes your point. And then finally, the final book I'd recommend to you, and this kind of cuts back to Dr. Patton's comments too on in fact, I actually think he used the phrase on the shoulders of giants. But the late Stephen Hawking, the physicist from Great Britain, passed away a couple of years ago, I think. In 2002, he wrote a book called On the Shoulders of Giants, The Great Works of Physics and Astronomy. And it really wasn't a book. It was a book for people like myself that were not physicists or astronomers. It was a book for lay people. But the point that Dr. Hawking was making in that powerful book was that every one of us, regardless of the field that we work in and live in, and it keeps our interest, we stand on the shoulders of the knowledge that was created by significant minds ahead of us. In his case, he was talking about Copernicus and Kepler and Galileo and Newton and those folks. But they really drove home the point that what we know now is completely dependent on the minds and work of very bright people that came along ahead of us. And they did us the favor of documenting their work so that you and I can reference that and use it now as we chip away out on the outer edges of new knowledge with the research that we conduct and the research that we consume and synthesize. Because a lot of that, I suspect some of you are having a little difficulty seeing how you'll use research in your role, other than action research. Some of you have already engaged in that. Certainly those of you that pursue the doctorate will have to engage in some real formal research. But it's my belief that high quality and highly effective leaders are constantly consuming literature across fields. And then they synthesize that. They pull out the pearls and use that with their faculties or with their teams or with their students. And then it's like an ongoing, never-ending literature review, really. But you're constantly in the process of synthesizing all that knowledge that you're consuming. I'm going to take a look at the chat box now and answer your questions. I was so thankful last week that a few of you actually asked me some questions. I hope you don't ask me tricky ones, but I don't want to have to think too much. But let me take a look at the chat box and see if somebody has something. Rebecca, where can I find the details of what's required for the final research proposal? That's going to be, I thought I'd already given that to you. Didn't I already give you a final exam in some form or another? Some of you are nodding. Is that, how did I deliver that to you? Was that in the discussion forum or was it in some other forum? Someone answer me if you remember. Discussion. Okay, thank you, Anna. So Rebecca, you can take a look back at those discussion prompts if you want to. I'm going to be pitching that final exam at you. Thank you, week 3. But I am going to pitch that final exam at you this week. You'll get it Saturday or Friday officially, but you should have it already in that stream of communications that I've sent to you earlier. But to answer your question, I'm not trying to be evasive. You know, I'm going to ask you for the nuts and bolts pieces of a research proposal. Obviously, it's going to be the driving question. I'm going to ask you what methodology you intend to use. I'm going to ask you what barriers or challenges you anticipate facing. I'm going to ask you what sample size and how you're going to recruit sample. Those things that you should be getting much more comfortable pulling out of the studies that you're reading every week. I think the structural piece of that work is probably becoming fairly second nature to you at this point. Let's see, Dawn has a question. Is there going to be a second discussion prompt this week? Yeah, and it should land probably about 3 in the morning. Dawn, I don't sleep very well. 3 or 4 or 5 in the morning, I'll pitch another one at you. Going to go out of town for fall break. Huh? Y'all have fall break? What? No. Well, we're not stopping. But anyway, that should land early in the morning, Dawn. And so that's the nice part about, that's one of the things I love about the online environment is you can schedule your time accordingly. And particularly the way I structure the courses, there shouldn't be any surprises coming at you. Let's see, other question for me. What kind of festival, Jamie? Oh. You know, my ranch, I live out near Lubbock, Texas, and we raise a lot of cotton. Most of it is irrigated here because we're in the arid regions. We raise a lot of cotton here, but we don't have a cotton festival. It's way too dry to raise rice here. When it rains here, we got about 3 inches of rain on my ranch here last week, and the day after we got the 3 inches, you couldn't hardly find a mud puddle anywhere. It just soaks right in, or the wind blows it off pretty quickly. Other questions you got for me? Y'all letting me off the hook here. Not making me squirm at all. Mary, I'm scheduled to teach in the next term, AP2 in the fall. I'm scheduled to teach not EDL, ED 720, which is a curriculum course. And then also we'll have another section of the internship. Quite a few of you are in the 716 internship process. That's really not an academic course, but so those are the two I'm on the books to teach right now. And the last time I peeked into that curriculum course, it looked like there was over 80 people signed up for that one already. But that, like this course, they're both in this intro to grad research and that curriculum course. I get it both from the CNI people and from the MEDL people. So it's populated with folks of 2 different varieties of folks. Jamie, yes, there will be assignments. The assignment schedule for week 7 looks exactly like the assignment schedule for all the other weeks, but you just have the final added to it. But you've known what the final looks like since week 3, so it shouldn't. I don't think that'll be a particularly daunting task for you to do that one. Well, thank you, Dawn. I appreciate that. It was my intention that you learned something. I've enjoyed it too, Laura. I hope some of you are getting pretty close to graduation. I think. Anybody graduating in December?
Yeah, this is my last class.
Yeah, and then you're going to start your doctorate, right?
Boy, I thought about it, but a break sounds nice too. So we'll see what working without school is like for a little while.
Well, you're used to not sleeping now, so strike while the iron's hot. But good luck to you. I will see you. Are you going to be there in person? You're not going to be there in person, are you? Well,
Nope.
if they live stream it, I'll wave at you. I hope they don't make me wear that goofy damn hat. I don't mind wearing the Gandalf robe or what was the wizard in Harry Potter? It wasn't Gandalf, was it? Who was it?
Dumbledore.
Dumbledore. Yeah, that's who I wanted to be. I don't mind wearing the robe, but I just don't like wearing that hat. Okay, well, thank you all again for letting me be part of this learning journey. Just like Southwest Airlines, I know you have a lot of options, and I'm really glad you chose LSU, but most importantly, I'm glad you chose to let me go along with you. You know how to contact me if you need me, so ping me if you need me, and that goes for even after this term ends. So good luck to you, and I'll see you next term, maybe, or at least some term out in the future. Have a good night.